Good afternoon, and welcome to another very informative program through the International Affairs Forum at Northwestern Michigan College. My name is Jim Bensley. I'm Director of International Services and Service Learning at the college. I also serve on the IAF Advisory Board, and I teach in the Humanities Department, specifically a course on world cultures. And I want to thank my students today for being here and taking this in. I think you're going to learn a lot from our guest today, and hopefully so will the rest of the audience. So again, thank you on behalf of IAF, and let me also thank our sponsor today, our underwriter, Miss Eleanor Lynn, who graciously stepped up to provide the opportunity for us to listen to Kim Ghattas. And we're lucky to have Kim with us today. I know this is an unfamiliar time for many of you as far as our programming, but we're excited to have her here in the afternoon. And we hope that you will continue to join us whenever we have programming at all hours of the day. No, we will keep to our usual schedule, but today we have a special treat having Kim here, and we're happy to allow her to be with us. So without further ado, let me hand the reins over to my colleague, Ms. Leila Halal, Director of the International Affairs Forum at Northwestern Michigan College, and she will introduce Kim.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim. I'm really thrilled to be here to introduce Kim Ghattas. I met Kim in Washington, D.C. in 2011 when she was covering U.S. foreign policy for BBC and writing her first book, The Secretary, A Journey with Hillary Clinton from Beirut to the Heart of American Power. Kim's unique style combines news and analysis with human stories that transcend borders. Her work is smart, empathetic, personal, and political, all the pieces that keep us informed and engaged in real ways. Through her journalism and writing, she has come to be a leading voice on politics and culture in the Middle East and in the United States. Born and raised in Beirut of Dutch and Lebanese parents, Kim's professional life has spanned continents. In addition to her New York Times bestseller, The Secretary, Kim authored the notable Black Wave, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the 40-year rivalry that unraveled culture, religion, and collective memory in the Middle East, published just this year. Kim's story and many, many interviews and articles are contained in her excellent website, which a link to which her website is in the chat box. So you can explore her background further through that chat box link. Thank you so much. Kim, we're really happy to have you here.
I'm really delighted, Leila, to be joining you for this conversation. It's great to see you again, albeit virtually. Thank you to the International Affairs Forum for having me. Thank you, Jim, for the introduction. And apologies for the odd timing for the event, but I'm in Beirut, where it is 9 p.m. at the moment. And so I'm delighted to be spending my evening with you all.
Yes, thank you. We have 150 people tuned in, so we're really thrilled to have everyone joining us. Kim, I thought we'd start off sort of talking about what many people sort of might associate Beirut with these days, and that is that the big blast that happened over the summer, about 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, a very explosive chemical fertilizer at the port of Beirut, leaving many homeless and injured. And I think, you know, that's how many people may associate Beirut and Lebanon. Others will know Beirut for its cosmopolitan nature and vibrant culture. And so I'm wondering if you can share with us a little bit about that blast and what life is like now in Beirut and Lebanon.
You know, before the blast, Lebanon had already been going through quite a bit of upheaval. Not only had we been dealing with the pandemic like the rest of the world, but since October 2019, so just over a year ago, we'd also been going through something of an uprising, a revolution, and there had been protests that started in October 2019 against corruption, against the sectarian system, against the political establishment, against the entrenchment of this establishment at all levels of political and economic life. And there's been a financial economic collapse in the country that has seen food prices soar. People's savings are trapped in the banks. You cannot access your money easily. It's being rationed. There's a brain drain out of the country, and no real light for now at the end of the tunnel. Then comes the pandemic, which aggravates everything. And then comes this horrific blast on August the 4th at 6:07 in the evening. You know, Leila, I lived through 15 years of civil war, or 13 to be precise, because I was born 2 years into the civil war. And I have lived through some really awful days. We lived on the front lines of the civil war. We were really right in the middle of it. And there are some really, really bad days. Life goes on in some strange way, in, you know, as normal a fashion as possible. You go to school, you come back, you try to have Sunday lunch. If you can see friends after school in the afternoon, but we lived in a pretty difficult area, so I didn't have much socializing after school. So just to say how bad things were, not to make this into a sob story, because war also made me who I am. And it's why I became a journalist and why I want to write books. But it just tells you something when I then say that August the 4th of this year was the worst day of my life. It was the worst day of the lives of many, many, many people. At first, we were unsure what had happened, what was happening, because it started with me first getting news of a fire at the port. And I saw the images of this fire at the port, and I was wondering what it was. And my first thought went to sabotage of some sort, wondering whether perhaps there had been sabotage of the port in, you know, some mysterious ways, because we'd seen over the summer mysterious attacks in Iran against a nuclear facility, against the port in Bushehr. And so I was wondering whether this was something similar, whether perhaps Israel was involved or something else, or whether it was arson. And then the earth started shaking. You know, I live about 5 miles away from the Beirut port. The Beirut port is quite centrally located in a way. It sort of is part of the city. It's not far away. It's not in the suburbs. It's not outside of populated areas. I live 5 miles away from there, and the building that I live in started shaking. And I thought it was an earthquake. And then we heard the whoosh and the loud bangs, and they came one after the other, and there were about 3 of them. And I thought it was an Israeli air raid, because that's the sound that I recognized. And then we realized that it had been an explosion, and the sheer panic of those first few hours, the sort of utter disorientation you feel. Remember that this was later described as the largest non-nuclear explosion in the, you know, in recent history. So just imagine the intensity of that blast. And I really feel that it sort of left a mark in our cells, in our DNA. A lot of people in Beirut will tell you that they had some kind of memory loss from the shock. For, you know, days went by, and we were all in a daze, in a haze. And there are days of August where none of us remember really what happened or where we were or what we were doing. The impact was horrific. First of all, of course, it killed over 200 people. Initially, the death toll was at around 160, and then it kept rising because people succumbed to their very grave injuries. You have some 6,000 people who were injured, and you have 300,000 people who were left homeless. The devastation around the port of Beirut was beyond description. And I say was because I was personally very selfishly unable to visit immediately after. I just couldn't do it. I just could not be faced with that level of destruction. I'd seen too much of it in my life. And so it took me a long time to be able to go back there. And when I went back about 2 months later, I was really flabbergasted to see how quickly people, and I say people, not the state and not the government, had worked to clear the debris, rebuild what they could, clean up, replace glass panes, whatever they could do to bring a semblance of normalcy. Again, you still see the damage, you still see the empty homes. But it's alive again. And it's an incredible testament to the Lebanese people that they could do this after everything that they've been through, after all the adversity they've had to overcome, that they could somehow still get it together and overcome this as well, or at least try to, because the trauma is deep, the scars are deep, and the impact will be long lasting. I had a lot of my friends who were injured, friends of friends who were killed, people who lost their homes, their shops, sometimes both. They lost their car, their shop, their home. Just a point about how, the state's utter lack of response, utter lack of responsibility. No one apologized. No one took responsibility. The investigation has gone nowhere. No one really resigned. I mean, the cabinet resigned under popular pressure, but it was almost more of a pro forma gesture. But all the leaders are still there, and they're trying to form yet another cabinet. It was civil society that got together and did the cleanup, because even there, the state failed. So it was the people, the NGOs, the civil society, the international aid organizations, the neighbors, the people who came from northern Lebanon, from southern Lebanon, from eastern Lebanon to come and help Beirut. And they did it. And they helped rebuild and gather the funds and fundraise. The world suddenly paused in the middle of a pandemic that had consumed everyone's attention, everyone's lives. The world paused and turned its attention towards Lebanon. And the fundraising effort around the world has been absolutely incredible. And it tells you something about how Beirut means something to a lot of people who have visited, who are connected, who are second, third generation Lebanese, who have friends who are Lebanese, who have been touched by this city somehow. In the words of Anthony Bourdain, the celebrity chef, the late celebrity chef who came to this city, got stuck in a war here in 2006 and yet fell in love with Beirut and returned several times. He described the city as a place where everything is possible, where everything that's beautiful and ugly is here. And he said everything wrong with the world is here, but it's also a place of unbelievable possibility. 300,000 people were left homeless, and yet there is not a tent to be seen around the city, because everyone found a home. Their neighbors, their relatives, their friends, hotels opened their doors. So there is hope there. But there's also a lot of sadness, Leila, because this country is very elastic. It seems to be able to, extend and extend to a breaking point that never comes. But we're also seeing collapse of services, further collapse of the infrastructure, an incredibly rapid brain drain, because for a lot of people, that blast was the last straw. We have hundreds of doctors who are leaving the country. hundreds of young people who are choosing to leave and study abroad. And so that's very sad to see as well. On a day-to-day basis, for many people, life goes on as best as we can. We're under lockdown because of the COVID crisis, the pandemic. So we're under lockdown again with a curfew from 5 p.m. till 5 in the morning, no driving on Sundays, alternate number plates during the week. So there's just a lot to deal with at the same time. But somehow, perhaps naively, I still remain hopeful.
Yeah, I know a lot of people are fleeing, but you remain in Beirut. So we wish you all the best as you
I
withstand the
remain
spirit.
because I feel it's important.
Mhm.
Not to say that those who are leaving are, failing their duty as citizens, not at all. Everybody has different circumstances. I happen not to have children, and so I don't need to worry about the safety of young ones, about whether they'll be able to go to school, or about whether I'll be able to pay for their school fees, because a lot of Lebanese are sliding into poverty because they're not able to access their savings, their money, because everything has become so expensive. It's become very hard to make a living here. And so if you can leave and offer a better, safer life for your children, you do. I happen to have moved back to from the US to Lebanon in 2017 to write my book, and I decided to stay. And I have so many reasons why I want to stay. I love my country. And I have this privilege that I don't need to make the difficult decisions about whether to leave or stay. I can stay. I can also choose to leave if I wanted to. But I've chosen to remain here and witness this incredible moment in history and do whatever I can to shed light about it, which is why I'm here speaking to you from Beirut.
Right. Well, thank you, and we really hope for the best. You recently wrote in the Atlantic a piece comparing what's happening here in the United States to your experiences in Beirut. And so many of the things that you're describing are not maybe dissimilar to the experiences that we are having right now in this country. I mean, not as extreme, obviously, and without a major war-like event of the blast. But can you reflect a little bit with us on that comparison that you drew in the piece?
Mm. It started with the 2016 presidential campaign. At the time, I was covering the Hillary campaign, and I was just struck by how much what I was seeing reminded me of politics in the Middle East. And at the time, I wrote a tongue-in-cheek piece about the different ways in which the campaign reminded me of the region that I come from. Whether it was at the time candidate Donald Trump claiming that he could do anything, even shoot someone on Fifth Avenue in New York, and people would still vote for him. That sounded very much like what an autocrat dictator in the Middle East would say. To Ted Cruz claiming victory after, I believe, New Hampshire, and saying something along the lines of "to God the victory," which to me sounded very, very strange, and reminded me of people in the Middle East when they're celebrating or mourning, they'll say "Allahu Akbar," God is the greatest, which is a phrase that unfortunately has become associated with radicalism, but is really just an everyday way of praising the Lord. When you have a young baby daughter that is born, or your son graduates from high school, or etc. And so these little details started making me think of the Middle East. And I watched the Trump presidency from a distance, because I came to Beirut to do my research and write my book. And from a distance, I was observing more and more of these similarities. And there were many times over the last year that I would wake up to headlines on my Twitter feed and wonder, I had to pause for a second, wait, is this about the US or is this about Lebanon? I'm not sure. There was one about the middle class dying, which was in the New Yorker. And that was about the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on the middle class in the US. But there was a similar piece about the middle class being, dying as well, or being damaged by, really impoverished by the pandemic and the financial crisis in Lebanon. And then just generally, Layla, the polarization, the otherization, the inability of people to listen to each other and find the common ground. The rise of more and more militias, watching the protests this summer and the militias, mostly on the far right, but also on the left, the violence, the deployment of military on the streets of the capital, of the nation's capital, men in uniforms in Portland, Oregon, picking up protesters from the street, men in uniforms without any, identifying signs, taking people to unknown locations. This is the kind of stuff that we deal with in the Middle East. And I know that, comparisons are not perfect and histories are different. And, we have our particularities and our history, and the US has its own history and particularities. But I think one thing that the Trump presidency has shown us, but also the pandemic, is that at the end of the day, we're also all very similar. And it's not enough to have institutions to be a democracy. Institutions feed off societies and societies feed off them. And, that is supposed to be a virtuous circle. But the failings of countries like the US or France or the UK in dealing with the pandemic are in a way a sort of, a flattener or an equalizer. At the end of the day, when something like this hits, we're all equal, unfortunately. And the Trump presidency has also shown the vulnerabilities of the US system and how institutions can also be diverted and abused by those in power, whatever country they are. Now, the system holds up. And what I argue in my piece is that a lot of what President Trump has done, for those who don't support him and were critical of him, they'll be relieved to see that it can be rolled back or undone with presidential orders by Joe Biden when he does get into the White House, change of personnel at the top. But what is harder to undo is this sort of shift in norms, in frames of reference, in values that become sort of a more insidious transformation of society, particularly with this polarization, and where everything shifts. The center shifts and the norms have moved. So the far left and the far right, everything has moved to one side. And what was normal 10 years ago is no longer the norm today.
Yeah, as you were describing the various dynamics, I was unclear if you were talking about Lebanon or the United States. And it's a very prescient sort of suggestion and input from you. And I think we'll circle back to what the US looks like from the Middle East. But I'd like to talk a little bit about your book, your recent book that was published in January, Black Wave.
Just before the pandemic.
Yeah, before the pandemic. And
it was a quarantine read for a lot of people.
Right, and so you that in that book you sort of talk, the springboard for the book, as I had read into it, was your own experience living through civil war and trying to understand how this rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two major powers in the Middle East, sort of shaped your experience and other experiences in the region. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that rivalry and your own story and the other stories that you sort of weave into your book?
You know, Leila, when I was growing up during the Civil War, of course, I was young, so I wasn't that aware of geopolitics. But even in the immediate, in the years that followed immediately, it wasn't that clear to me yet what the role of that rivalry was, or that, shall I say, that rivalry had not really come to my attention as a factor in the geopolitics of the region. Neither had the year 1979, which is really the year that I based my thesis on, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Because sometimes it takes a while, and it takes the ability to step back and look at history from a bit of a distance to understand what was really going on and what it meant. And what I do with this book is I look back at 40 years of history in the region to try to understand how things unraveled and why. And the starting point is the year 1979, which is really a vintage year of news events around the world, but particularly in the region. Three things happened that year. The Iranian Revolution, which brings the return of Ayatollah Khomeini from exile back to Tehran. And he basically hijacks what is mostly a leftist nationalist revolution and turns it into an Islamic revolution and turns Iran into an Islamic republic. The second event of that year is the siege of Mecca in November of 1979 by Saudi zealots, who in essence feel that the royal family is not pious enough and not doing its job properly as custodians of the two holy sites in Islam. And the third event in December of that year is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Those three events are initially unrelated, unconnected, but they become inextricably linked. And they bring about a series of events that wash over the region for the following few decades. What it does is, first of all, it turns Saudi Arabia and Iran, two countries that were, friendly regional competitors, twin pillars in US policy in the region. It turns them into mortal enemies. And what that means is, beyond the geopolitics of having these two powerful countries turn into enemies, because one is Sunni, Saudi Arabia, and one is Shia, Iran, perfectly happy to be friends before, when they become mortal enemies, they use sectarian identities to whip up their respective camps against each other. And so suddenly, not only do you have Iran and Saudi Arabia turn into rivals, but you have the Sunni and Shia identities used and weaponized to feed into that rivalry. And you start seeing, for the first time in modern history, real sectarian violence, and it becomes worse and worse as time passes. So those are two ideas or two thoughts about the region that people usually have that I dispel in the book, that Iran and Saudi Arabia were always enemies. They were not. It started in 1979. The other idea people have is that Sunnis and Shias have always killed each other, and they have not. It started in 1979, even though, of course, the schism, the theological dispute, is a historical one. But over the course of history, Sunnis and Shias have probably killed each other less than Catholics and Protestant. And the third element that I explore, and which derives from these first two changes, is the rise of cultural intolerance. With the rise of sectarianism and the use of religion as a tool to subjugate and to dominate, this feeds the rise of bigotry, intolerance, radicalism, and it changes people's understanding of their own culture over time, their own understanding of their religion and how it should be practiced. And that's what I describe over the course of the 40 years as I go from Egypt to Pakistan, from Syria to Iraq, from Lebanon to Saudi Arabia and Iran, I tell the stories of the people whose lives were upended by the geopolitics and how so many of them fought back against this black wave that washes over the region. So it's a bit of a 1001 nights of modern geopolitics to try to answer the question of what happened to us. It's the question that I pose at the start of the book, that I try to answer, because I think it's important to understand what happened so that you can try to repair whatever damage you see in front of you. And today, the question, what happened to us, is a question that I hear being posed in the United States.
Right, and then of course Syria, which went through a very brutal civil war, is where that rivalry that you're describing sort of manifested in a way that really was really quite awful. And so we saw in that sort of period this rivalry, Sunni Shiite rivalry, playing out in Syria between Gulf states that were arming an opposition and Iran that was backing the Syrian government. And in the middle of that rivalry sort of stood civil society, which was considered sort of the bright spot of both the Arab uprising and what took place in Syria. And I'm jumping around a little bit, but I want to be sure that our viewers have a full scope of what we can talk about in the Q&A. And what I want to bring out now is sort of the way in which civil society is mobilized in Lebanon, and how that might be a bright spot in the context of these deep historical rivalries. You had the civil society uprisings in Beirut. I'm wondering what came about with those protests. How have they changed governance in Lebanon, and what is the future post-blast?
It's a work in progress. It's a work in progress. In some ways, nothing has changed, because we're still dealing with the same leaders. The opposition group, civil society, have not yet been able to produce a functioning coalition of the protest movement, let's say, has not led yet to a coalition of opposition movement that can truly challenge the leadership, the establishment, this sort of, political mafia cartel type establishment that rules us and that has been in power forever. Some of these politicians were warlords during the Civil War, and they're still there. And it's very hard to remove them. What has become clear is that protests on their own aren't going to cut it. And I think that what we're going to see is smaller challenges at a governance level, trying to win back the syndicates, trying to win student elections, challenges in courts of law, if not in Lebanon, because people don't trust the judiciary maybe, then in international courts of law. We've seen some of that already happening. Dual citizens who live in France or the UK, who are going to take Lebanese banks to court in the UK because as UK citizens, their savings are stuck in a Lebanese bank. I think we're going to see more of that. And then, of course, we're looking at legislative elections, parliamentary elections in 2022. And I would suspect that a lot of people are going to start working to get ready for these elections in a systematic, methodical way to try to really challenge the establishment, or if you want to call it also, the deep state, which is a term that Americans are now familiar with as well, and which is again one that I thought was only used in countries like Egypt or Iraq. And so there is definitely an effort in Lebanon, but also in Iraq, to challenge the establishment, to push for elections, to push for change at a local level, at a national level. And we've seen some successes. I would like to really emphasize that the uprisings that started in the Arab world in 2011 have not failed. They're just not over yet. In Sudan, protests there have delivered an incredible result. They have a transitional government. They've overturned a lot of the laws that Omar Bashir had put in place. They've overturned a 30-year-old dictatorship. They have, women rising in positions like to be judges. It's astounding what is happening in Sudan. And I think it can be done elsewhere. The problem in countries like Iraq and potentially in Lebanon is that efforts like this are often met with violence. And we've seen a very scary campaign of assassinations in Iraq, not just against very well-known activists or thinkers like a friend of many people and my friend Husham al-Hashmi, who was brutally shot outside his home over the summer, but assassinations of lower level activists, thinkers, journalists, whose assassination will not necessarily make headlines, but whose death removes a link in the chain of events that makes change possible. And so I would like to just pause here and say that it's very important for people in the US to understand that there is a movement for change, and people are standing up for governance, for rights, for their rights, for freedom of expression, for tolerance, for diversity, for pluralism. It doesn't always get covered by the Western press. And it's also a huge mountain to climb because of the violence that you can be met with when you push for change in this region.
Yes. Again, there's familiarities between what you're describing in Lebanon and the US. I want to open it up for questions from the audience. We already have some questions in the chat box. If you, for those of you who may have questions pending, please go ahead and submit them. Mike Leonard has asked, what is the relationship between the leadership of the 2005 Cedar Revolution and the current leadership in Lebanon today? I guess you mean the revolutionary leadership.
Yeah. So, well, or who's in charge today and what happened to those leaders of the Cedar Revolution. So first of all, thank you for your question, Michael. It's an important one because it brings me back to the point I was just making, which is the threat of assassinations and the threat of violence. A lot of the most brilliant minds of that Cedar Revolution, the real thinkers in that revolution, were assassinated. There was a string of assassinations following the major one that ignited the revolution, the assassination of Rafiq Hariri, the former prime minister, who was killed in a massive car bomb in February 2005. His assassination has been pinned on operatives from Hezbollah in the International Court of Justice in a UN trial. Following that assassination, there was a string of other assassinations because the people who want to stay in power are always looking for who can challenge them on the level of the ideas, of alternative, of offering a plan for the future. Who amongst my opponents has a vision for the future? I'll go for him and I'll kill him. And that's how leaders in this region managed to stay in power, by killing free thought and by killing those who can challenge them on the level of ideas and an alternative and a vision for the future. And so people like the writer and journalist Samir Qasir, the government advisor Muhammad Shatah, the newspaper editor Gibran Twaini, they were all killed in cold blood. And they are dearly missed today because they would have made a huge difference to the protests that have been taking place since October. Some of the leaders of that revolution at the time were politicians from the establishment who had risen up against the status quo of the Syrian occupation in Lebanon and the Syrian dominance of Lebanon. And you had two camps, those who opposed Syria's dominance and those who still supported it, like Hezbollah. And the Cedar Revolution was, to simplify, the anti-Syrian camp. But over time, that camp, also lost its way and no longer represents the will of the people. They've become the establishment as well, because they lack the presence of people like the writers and journalists that I just mentioned. Today, the protest movement is leaderless, partly because the protesters were very wary of having leaders who could become target of assassination. With time, it has become clear that that is also a disadvantage because there is no interlocutor. So when the French president Emmanuel Macron comes to Lebanon to try to find a way forward for the country after the blast of August the 4th, he meets with leaders of the government and the politicians, but there's no real coalition from the opposition that he can meet with. There are lots of different people, but no movement. And I think that this is what we might see emerge over the next year and a half, something that brings together people in an organized way, because I think that's what it's going to take to dislodge the establishment.
Does the U.S. have a role to play in creating that, in helping that opposition and civic representation emerge in Lebanon? Positive and potentially negative, and what? Yes. So I'll leave it there and do a follow-up question.
It's always tricky. What should the U.S. role be and what should the U.S. involvement be? Because in some ways, there's been too much outside involvement in Lebanon, whether it's the U.S. or Iran or France or Russia or etc. On some level, it's inevitable. We are in a region where everybody wants a piece of the pie or a role to play. Not my advice, but my observation, let's say, about the best way forward is a combination of continued pressure on the establishment to somehow find it within themselves to reform, although I don't see them being able to do that. And then therefore maintain the pressure on the fact that there can be no further aid to Lebanon unless there are reforms. You cannot continue to give grants and loans and free money to a political establishment which then just ends up squandering that money. I don't know how you square that with the terrible impact that it will have on us, the people, but there are ways of bypassing the government and coming to the direct assistance of NGOs, civil society, doing stuff via the World Bank and so on. And we've already seen a lot of that. There are a lot of initiatives, helping the private sector as well in whatever ways that do not feed the political establishment, because obviously, they have their hands in everything as well in the economy. vocal support for reforms, for governance, and for justice, and the end of impunity. One of the problems I find often in Western policy towards countries in the region is the need for expedient solutions. When things take too long, when things get too complicated, the minute that there is a threat to Western interests, the expedient solution is to just go back to what you know. And what you know is usually the dictator. The dictator will keep things calm. The dictator will keep things stable. The dictator will make sure that no terrorists reach our shores. Unfortunately, the dictators, whether they're the multiple ones in Lebanon, or I speak of the sort of the dictatorship of the variety of leaders that we have, or the dictator in Syria or in Egypt or elsewhere, they only feed the problem. Stability at all cost ends up blowing up in all our faces. And so I think it's time to rethink how the US approaches the Middle East. And I'm not trying to be coy. I don't have very well formulated answers just yet, because it's actually a piece that I'm trying to write. And I'm still trying to sort of, wade through my thoughts. But I think, focus on governance, justice, and pressure for real reforms.
That sounds like a fascinating piece, and we look forward to it. I have two more questions in the queue, and we have about 10 minutes left. So I'll put them both forward to you, and maybe you can answer them with your next intervention. The first one is related to sort of what you're talking about, and it regards Hezbollah's role in Lebanese politics and the power structure in Lebanon. How has that been impacted by the blast, and what is the current status of the party's role in politics? And then the second question, and that question came from Eleanor Lynn, the second question from Robert Garvey concerns the Syrian refugees. Lebanon has taken in many refugees from Palestinians historically, Syrians more presently. What is their situation in Lebanon today?
I'll start with that one. Thank you for the question. We often forget the plight of Syrian refugees. Lebanon is a country of roughly 4.5 million people, Lebanese residents, and it is 4.5 million, I repeat, and it is home to about 1 million or 1.2 million Syrian refugees. If I do the math very quickly, that's like 80 million Mexicans showing up in America tomorrow. Can you just imagine what that would look like? How the country would respond, people, the government, how that would upend everything. Somehow, Lebanon has absorbed these refugees and did its best to welcome them because of what they had to endure in their own country. So after 2013, thousands started arriving and the numbers kept growing. And of course, some refugees went to Europe or made it to the US or elsewhere. But just imagine the burden that Lebanon has had to shoulder for the international community by hosting over 1 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And that's on top of the roughly 200,000 Palestinian refugees who have been here for decades. Refugees who came to Lebanon after the creation of the State of Israel and then after the 1967 Six-Day War. They live in difficult conditions, in camps, in tents, in unfinished, urban settlements. They are not allowed to work officially. International organizations had been struggling even before the pandemic to get the funds from international donors to be able to continue to support these refugees. It is a dark tunnel. And a lot of them are in the Eastern Bekaa Valley, where it is soon going to get very cold, where they will have to live with the snow and the mud and sewers. I must say that I'm suddenly wondering, how they're faring also with the pandemic. We've not heard of an outbreak in the refugee camps, and I must say I'm suddenly thinking that's a miracle, or it's very odd, and there must be something going on that we don't know about. But that's the answer about the refugees, and there's no prospect at the moment for them to be able to go back safely. As much as Lebanon's government would like to get rid of them, there is simply no way for them to have a real safe return to their country. A lot of people have gone back, have been rounded up, thrown in jail, or have found that there's nowhere for them to go back to because their homes and villages were destroyed. Eleanor, thank you so much for your question on Hezbollah. Hezbollah is part and parcel today of the establishment, and which means that when people now protest against the government and the corruption and the sectarianism, they're also protesting Hezbollah, which is a new development, because Hezbollah always stood or liked to pretend that it stood as this holier than thou party that was the national resistance, that fought to liberate southern Lebanon, and they were the uncorruptibles, and they were the ones who stepped in where the government failed and provided charity and schools and hospital services where the state did not deliver. But they've, over time, have shown very clearly not only that, obviously, we know their past, their violent past, and the reason why they're on the US State Department list of terrorist organizations, but they've shown also domestically how they have used their power to, in essence, take the country hostage. And they are part of the corruption, they're part of the establishment, they're part of what is stopping this country from moving forward. They took the country to war in 2006. They are at war they decided on their own that they would go to war in Syria to fight with Assad. They're involved in Yemen, in Iraq, and they've done all this without ever asking the opinion of any Lebanese, certainly not outside their community. So they have a lot of power. That includes the power of the gun, and that includes the backing of Iran. However, no one in Lebanon wants to take them on in a war because that would be a losing battle. What is possible is to use the law against them, to try to find a way whereby they must abide by the law. And if you push for enough reforms that can cut the grass from under their feet, and if you find a way to push for change and reform in a way that there is governance and a state that can actually deliver for its people, then what Hezbollah has to offer becomes not just a lot less attractive, but a lot less necessary. At the moment, they do fill a gap for the community. They do offer what the state cannot offer. And that's why I think, again, the emphasis on governance is essential.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks to everyone who tuned in. I think I would remind everyone that Kim's personal website, www.kimghattas.com, contains many of the works that she referenced in her presentation, as well as those forthcoming, I'm sure will be added there. So we're very thankful, Kim, that you joined us at the late hour at 9 p.m. in Beirut, 10 p.m. now.
Yeah.
And really very rich discussion. So thank you so much.
Yes,
And
thank you.
thank you. I want to thank everyone. IF is a member-supported enterprise that seeks to bring the world to Traverse City, and we depend on your support and donations to continue bringing you interesting conversations and topics such as Kim presented to us today. And I want to thank Eleanor Lynn for underwriting this event, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Please stay abreast of our forthcoming program in this winter, starting again in February. You can tune into the website www.tcif.com for information on that forthcoming program. Will be made available as soon as possible. Stay healthy and engaged. Thank you so much.